So just to give you a brief introduction to who I am, I've been a lawyer for a few years now, and I've been at Waterfront for just over 2 years, and I've had a lot of dealings recently with free and open source software, particularly in the last few months actually with Ecovia recently, both from the developer side and the customer side. So that's why I'm standing in front of you today. So like all areas of law, free and open source software is a very large topic. So in the few minutes that we have, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to open source software, talk about a couple of free and open source software licenses, and then give you a couple of practical and legal considerations as to how to avoid some of the issues that I'm going to raise today. So what is free and open source software? It's something that gives us lawyers real headaches a lot of the time, because a lot of the licenses out there are really badly drafted and they're needlessly complicated, which makes the job of interpreting them really hard, and it makes our job of advising you guys, our clients, very uncertain and often very time-consuming. In essence, free and open source software is software that is provided on licenses that grant licensees certain freedoms. So that's in contrast to closed or proprietary software that is looking to impose restrictions or conditions, and it's also in contrast to software that's provided for free, so it's often known as freeware. So confusingly, if software is free, it's not necessarily free in open source software. So let's have a quick look at some of the advantages of using free and open source software. So for developers, it's about freeing up developer time so you can go ahead and develop more projects. It's about accelerating time to market so you can get that product out to market a lot quicker. It's about offering more attractive prices to your customers. It's also very useful for bug fixes and enhancements as well. And so for users as well, it's really good for security. Having access to the source code means that you can detect flaws a lot more easily. It's cheaper, it can be customized by anyone, and that ability to customize it means that you have some sort of protection from product discontinuation. So let's have a look at or talk about some of the free and open source licenses out there. So the open source initiative was launched back in 1998, and that has the job of reviewing and approving open source software licenses. That approval system is based on what's called the open source software definition, and that has a set of 10 criteria that all open source software licenses have to comply with, and those criteria include making sure that the software can be freely redistributed, the source code, distribution and source code form must be allowed, has to allow modifications to the work, and it mustn't place restrictions on other software that's distributed with it. There are currently 82 licenses out there that have been approved by the Open Source Initiative, and I've listed some of the more famous that you may already have heard of, so the BSD, MIT, Apache, Mozilla Public License, and the General Public License as well. You can generally put all the open source software license on a scale ranging from the more permissive, so the ones that have the least amount of restrictions, and they include the BSD, MIT, and Apache licenses. You then have the more restrictive, which is led by the General Public License, and then in the middle you've got the Mozilla Public License, which is kind of in between. But for the purpose of this talk today, I'm going to focus on both extremes. Incidentally, the most popular license out there at the moment is the General Public License. 44% of all licenses in use is actually the General Public License version 2. So let's go into permissive open source software license. So as I said, permissive are the ones with the least amount of restrictions, and the most popular one is the MIT license, which is actually reproduced in full here. I'm not going to read it out, don't worry. The most operative wording I wanted you to focus on was the one in bold in the biggest writing in the first paragraph. And I'm just going to read that out so that it gives you the permission to deal in the software without restriction, including without limitation. Can't read that. Including without limitation, the rights to use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, and or sell copies of the software, and to permit persons to whom the software is furnished to do so. So it's a really, really wide license. Effectively gives proprietary software developers the right to integrate it into their own code, to license it on their own license terms. So you can see why it's so popular with proprietary software developers. There are very few conditions on its use. As you can see that the second paragraph there, the only conditions there are to reproduce the copyright notice and the permission notice. So in summary, sorry, not in summary. One more thing was the BSD license as well, which is very similar. Again, very few restrictions, and much like the MIT license, it can be used for pretty much anything. So in conclusion now, the permissive licenses are good for lawyers and good for developers as well. So let's have a look at the non-permissive and copyleft licenses. And as I said before, the GPL license version 2 is the most popular license in use at the moment, so I'm going to focus on that for the purpose of this section. The GPL version, the general public license, was started by a guy called Richard Stallman back in 1989. And version 2 came out in 1991, so it's been going for about 20 years now. And it's a license that is subject to much controversy and much debate, and that's all because of this section that I've highlighted here, section 2B. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to read it out, so do bear with me. So what the section says is that you may modify your copy or copies of the programs, that's the open source software that's being licensed under the license, or any portion of it, thus forming a work based on the program, and copy and distribute such modifications or work, provided that you also meet all of these conditions. And they have 2 or 3 conditions, and the important one is section B, which says you must cause any work that you distribute or publish that in whole or in part contains or is derived from the program or any part thereof to be licensed as a whole at no charge to all third parties under the terms of this license. So what the wording there is showing is the real viral aspect of GPL licensed software and how it can infect your own software. What it's effectively saying is that if you choose to publish or redistribute your own software, and that contains or is derived from GPL licensed software, then that publication or redistribution must be done on the terms of the general public license. And this obviously presents a main problem for proprietary software developers who want to make sure their source code remains secret and confidential. It means that they're going to have to make sure that their source code is disclosed under the terms of the general public license. So it makes any competitive or commercial advantage that much weaker. The other problem is the fact that there's been absolutely no case law, both in the UK and the US, on the actual interpretation of this clause, which makes our job significantly harder as well. So the main problem, though, with this license is the word contains. And that's because the word contains can be interpreted very widely. On face value, contains can mean any communication or any combination that your software might have with GPL licensed software will render your software caught out under the terms of the license. So there are 2 fundamental questions that we need to ask. When is your software deemed to contain GPL code? And can a combination with GPL license code be viewed as separate and independent? Now, the Free Software Foundation, which is one of the bodies behind the general public license, issued some guidance on this. And they say, apologies, I'm going to have to read it out again. They say that when free and non-free programs must communicate at arm's length, that they are not combined in a way that would make them effectively a single program. If the 2 programs are combined so that they become effectively 2 parts of one program, then you can't treat them as 2 separate programs. So the GPL has to cover the whole thing. So what it's effectively saying is that provided your software and GPL licensed software remain distinct, you're going to be okay. However, if your software is combined with GPL licensed software in a way that makes one new program, then you run the risk that your software is going to be caught out under the license terms, and therefore you're going to have to redistribute it under the terms of the general public license. This kind of brings up also another debate that's been going on, and that's in relation to static linking and dynamic linking when it comes to combining two programs. Static linking occurs when a compiler is instructed to bind together your code, for example, and GPL license code permanently. So you're effectively creating one new program, you're effectively having one executable code, and under that's deemed to contain, your software would be deemed to contain GPL licensed software, and therefore you'd be forced to release your code under the GPL. Dynamic linking is different. It doesn't have a permanent combination of the 2 programs. They remain distinct and separate. So there's a theory that the argument that your work would contain GPL licensed code is considerably weaker. However, in my opinion, the warning is already there. And as lawyers, we're always advising clients, so far as they are able to try and avoid using GPL license code whenever you can. But how do you go about doing this? So I've just put in a few legal and practical considerations. So when I'm thinking about legal considerations, I'm coming from the point of view of a customer who's commissioned a developer to build some software. And you're going to want to have a very robust development agreement in place, and that agreement is going to have to refer to free and open source software. So the first option is to have a clause in your agreement which says that the developer cannot use any free and open source software in the development of your software. Excuse me. That's probably not very realistic, especially from the developer point of view, and also the customer point of view, in fact, because using no free and open source software means increased development times, and it also means that the cost is likely going to be a lot higher because the developer is going to be building from scratch. The other option is to have to restrict specific free and open source software. So in that you have a clause in your agreement which effectively says that you can use free and open source software provided it isn't licensed under the GPL, or in fact any licenses that have similar clauses to the general public license. And then the third option is permitting specific open source software. So you would list specific software in your schedule, but you have to be very careful in those instances because lots of software can be dual licensed, and by that I mean that there could be 2 free and open source software licenses that apply to it, or it could mean that there's a free and open source software license and a commercial license. So make sure that you specify which license is going to apply. And then from a developer point of view as well, there's some practical considerations. I've put there, evaluate the applicability of the license. So what I mean by that is that generally it can be quite obvious whether you're going to fall under the terms of the GPL. So if you're, for example, you make a slight modification to GPL licensed software, it's very likely that that modification is going to fall under the terms of the license. Conversely, if you're building a product independently, it's not being compiled with or linked with any GPL licensed software, then generally you're probably going to be okay. Monitor software acquisition. That means I appreciate that developers want their engineers to have a certain amount of freedom, but make sure you have some rules and procedures in place to make sure that the software that's been acquired is being noted down. Track changes and releases, so have some good review, have some proper revision controls in place. And finally, avoid the build guru, so the one guy that knows how to build your final release. Make sure the build process is well defined. And that's it. Any questions?